Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. In the heart of a dying empire, an old man is placed on the most powerful throne in the Islamic world. But his power is an illusion. He is Mehmed V, the Sultan Caliph who would preside over the Ottoman Empire's final cataclysmic war. While German generals command his armies and political zealots dictate his decrees, he is a prisoner in his own palace, a ghost haunting the halls of power. This is the story of the Puppet Sultan, the man who wore the crown but never held the scepter during the storm of World War I. In the opulent heart of the Ottoman Empire, within the sprawling marble halls of the Dolmabahce Palace, a prince was slowly fading into obscurity. This was not a prison of iron bars and stone walls, but one of silk cushions, gilded ceilings, and suffocating silence. For 30 long years, Şehzade Mehmed Reşad lived as a prisoner of his own brother, the formidable and deeply paranoid Sultan Abdülhamid II. Ascending to the throne in 1876, Abdülhamid saw shadows in every corner and conspiracies in every whisper. His brothers, potential claimants to the sacred throne of Osman, were the most dangerous shadows of all. Reşad, along with his younger half-brother, was confined to the Crown Prince's apartments, a luxurious cage where every visitor was a potential spy and every conversation was reported. He was forbidden from engaging in politics, from corresponding freely, from being anything more than a ghost in his own home. Denied the world of statecraft, Reşad retreated inward. He found solace in the arts, becoming a skilled calligrapher and a passionate student of Persian literature. He surrounded himself with books and poetry, his only trusted companions in a life defined by suspicion. His days were a monotonous rhythm of prayer, study, and quiet contemplation, punctuated by the ever-present fear of the assassin's blade or the poisoned cup, fates that had befallen many princes before him. This enforced isolation hollowed him out. It stripped him of ambition, of political acumen, of the very steel required to rule a sprawling, fracturing empire. He grew old in this gilded cage, a gentle, scholarly man, utterly unversed in the brutal realities of power. He was being shaped not for rule, but for irrelevance. While the world outside convulsed with nationalism, industrialization, and revolutionary fervor, Mehmed Reşad remained a relic, a man out of time, waiting for a destiny he never sought and was wholly unprepared to face. The year is 1909. The tremors of revolution have finally shattered the foundations of the old order. Sultan Abdülhamid II, the Red Sultan, the master of spies and secrets, has been overthrown. From the gilded silence of his apartments, a bewildered Mehmed Reşad is summoned. At the age of 64, after 3 decades of secluded irrelevance, he is to be Sultan. The scene of his accession is not one of triumphant celebration, but of profound and unsettling disorientation. He is brought before the parliament he barely knew existed, a frail, stooping figure with kind, anxious eyes, blinking in the sudden glare of public life. He is girded with the sword of Osman, the ancient symbol of sovereign power, but the hands that guide him, that place the crown upon his destiny, are not his own. They belong to the men of the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks. These are the ambitious, ruthless officers and ideologues who engineered the coup. They did not want a ruler, they wanted a symbol. They needed the legitimacy of the caliphate, the unbroken line of the House of Osman, to sanctify their new regime. And in the gentle, pliable Mehmed Reşad, they found the perfect instrument. He was proclaimed Sultan Mehmed V, a name intended to evoke the glory of Mehmed the Conqueror. But there was no conquest in his eyes, only confusion. He was a constitutional monarch, a concept utterly alien to the empire's DNA. He was expected to reign, but not to rule. His palace, once the epicenter of absolute power under his brother, was now merely a grand stage. The real power resided elsewhere, in the backrooms of the Sublime Porte and the military headquarters, where the Young Turk triumvirate was beginning to consolidate its grip. Mehmed V was a sultan of shadows, a sovereign in name only, inheriting a throne whose authority had already been bled dry. To understand Mehmed V's reign is to understand the men who placed him on the throne. The Young Turks were not a monolith. They were a fractious coalition of intellectuals, civil servants, and, most importantly, army officers. They were fueled by a desperate desire to save the empire from what they saw as its terminal decline under Abdülhamid's autocratic and reactionary rule. Their ideology was a potent, volatile mix of Ottomanism, constitutionalism, and a burgeoning, aggressive Turkish nationalism. They believed that only radical modernization, a centralized government, and a powerful, westernized military could prevent the sick man of Europe from being dismembered by foreign powers. When their 1908 revolution forced Abdülhamid to restore the constitution, it was a moment of euphoric hope across the empire. But this idealism quickly curdled into a brutal power struggle. By the time Mehmed V took the throne, the movement was dominated by a hardline military faction. Soon, a formidable triumvirate would emerge: the ambitious and vainglorious Enver Pasha, the calculating and ruthless Talat Pasha, and the pragmatic but stern Cemal Pasha. These three men would become the de facto dictators of the Ottoman Empire. For them, Sultan Mehmed V was an essential political tool. He was the Caliph, the spiritual leader of the world's Sunni Muslims, a title that carried immense weight both inside and outside the empire. They carefully curated his public image, presenting him as a benevolent father figure who endorsed their modernizing agenda. He would appear at ceremonies, read speeches written for him by the committee, and bestow honors upon their command. He was the sacred, traditional face of a radical, secularizing regime. He provided the illusion of continuity while the state was being fundamentally remade in the committee's image. His signature on a decree was a rubber stamp, his opinion an irrelevance. He was a prisoner once more, but this time his cage was the throne itself, the first true test of the new regime, and the first profound humiliation for its sultan came not from the volatile Balkans or the Russian frontier, but from across the Mediterranean. In September 1911, the Kingdom of Italy, hungry for its own colonial empire, declared war and invaded the Ottoman provinces of Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, modern-day Libya. The invasion was a brutal demonstration of the empire's weakness. The once mighty Ottoman navy, neglected for decades under Abdülhamid II, was a collection of rusting relics, completely incapable of challenging Italy's modern dreadnoughts. The sea lanes were cut. The empire could not reinforce its African territories. The land route was blocked by British-controlled Egypt, which declared neutrality. The Ottoman garrisons in Libya were isolated, abandoned to their fate. For Sultan Mehmed V, this was an agonizing blow. He was not just an emperor. He was the Caliph, the divinely appointed protector of Muslim lands. And now, under his reign, a European power was seizing a vast Islamic territory with impunity. The Young Turk government in Istanbul was thrown into chaos. Their grand promises of restoring Ottoman strength and prestige were exposed as hollow. While a handful of determined young officers, including a future leader named Mustafa Kemal, slipped into Libya to organize a fierce local resistance, the central government could do little more than protest diplomatically. The war revealed the first deep crack in the Young Turks' facade of competence. It drained the treasury, demoralized the army, and emboldened the empire's other enemies, particularly the Balkan states, who watched Italy's success with predatory interest. For Mehmed V, it was a personal and spiritual failure. He presided over a state that could not defend its own people. He was a powerless sovereign watching his domain shrink, a harbinger of the far greater losses that were to come. The loss of Libya was more than a territorial defeat. It was a wound to the soul of the empire and the beginning of the end. In the gilded quiet of Dolmabahce Palace, Sultan Mehmed V could hear the echoes of a world collapsing. The year was 1912. The ink on the constitution was barely dry, but the foundations of the empire itself were turning to dust. What began as a distant rumble in the Balkans soon became a deafening roar of defeat. A coalition of nations, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro, states once dismissed as mere Ottoman vassals, had united with a singular, ferocious purpose: to drive the Crescent from Europe for good. The Ottoman army, once the terror of Christendom, was now a shadow of its former self, hobbled by political infighting, poor leadership, and outdated equipment. The reports reaching the Sultan were a litany of despair. Kirk Kilisa, Lüleburgaz, Kumanovo, ancient Ottoman strongholds fell like dominoes. The swiftness of the collapse was breathtaking, a humiliation on a scale not seen in centuries. The Bulgarian army, a force the Porte had fatally underestimated, pushed to the very gates of Constantinople. For the first time since the 15th century, the call to prayer from the city's minarets was answered by the thunder of enemy artillery. Mehmed V, a man who had spent most of his life as a prisoner, was now a prisoner of a different kind, a sovereign presiding over a national funeral. He was compelled to issue proclamations he did not write, to endorse strategies he did not understand. He became the face of the disaster, a symbol of impotence. The loss of Adrianople, Edirne, the second capital of the early empire and home to the magnificent Selimiye Mosque, was a blow to the soul. It was more than a military defeat, it was a spiritual amputation. As refugees poured into the capital, bringing with them tales of horror and dispossession, the dream of Ottomanism, a unified empire of diverse peoples, died a bloody death in the mud of Thrace. The empire had lost 80% of its European territory and nearly 70% of its European population. For Sultan Mehmed V, the catastrophe wasn't just political. It was a profound, personal failure, the crumbling of the sacred inheritance he was powerless to protect. From the ashes of the Balkan disaster, a new power rose, forged in anger and ambition. The old guard, the liberal politicians who had overseen the humiliation, were discredited. The nation craved strength, decisiveness, and vengeance. It found them in three men, a triumvirate that would become the true masters of the empire. They were Enver, Talaat, and Jamal. In January 1913, Enver Pasha, the charismatic and dangerously ambitious Minister of War, led a dramatic coup d'etat. In a hail of bullets and shouting, he and his followers stormed the Sublime Porte, the center of Ottoman government, and forced the Grand Vizier to resign at gunpoint. This was the raid on the Sublime Porte, and it was more than a change of government. It was a seizure of the state. From that day forward, the Sultan's role became almost entirely ceremonial. Mehmed V would still sit on the throne, receive ambassadors, and lead prayers, but the strings of power were now held firmly in the hands of the three pashas. Enver was the sword, dashing, Germanophile, and obsessed with military glory and a grand vision of a pan-Turkic empire. Talat Pasha, the Minister of the Interior, was the iron fist, a pragmatic, ruthless administrator who controlled the internal machinery of the state. Jamal Pasha, Minister of the Marine, was the modernizer, determined to rebuild the Ottoman navy and project power. Together, they represented the most radical, nationalist faction of the Young Turks. They were men of action, contemptuous of the slow, deliberative politics of the past and the gentle, aging sultan who represented it. While Mehmed V remained in his palace, a symbol of continuity and Islamic legitimacy, the pashas were making decisions that would determine the fate of millions. They purged the army of their opponents, tightened their grip on the press, and began looking for a powerful European ally to help them reclaim lost glory and secure the empire against its enemies, chief among them, Russia. The Sultan was now a caliph in a cage, his seal a mere rubber stamp for the will of 3 determined men who were steering the ship of state directly into the gathering storm. Isolated and bleeding, the Ottoman Empire was a pariah in the great courts of Europe. Britain and France, once its traditional protectors against Russian expansion, now saw it as the sick man of Europe, an estate to be carved up. Russia, its eternal foe, circled like a vulture, dreaming of the day the Tsar's cross would replace the crescent atop the Hagia Sophia. In this desperate geopolitical landscape, the 3 pashas saw only one potential savior: the German Empire. The whispers from Berlin grew louder, more insistent. Unlike the other powers, Germany had no history of seizing Ottoman territory. Instead, it offered partnership, modernization, and respect. Kaiser Wilhelm II had twice visited the empire, posturing as a friend to the Sultan and the entire Muslim world. This was more than diplomacy, it was a strategic investment. German capital was funding the monumental Berlin-Baghdad Railway, a project designed to project German economic and military power deep into the Middle East. German officers, led by the capable General Lyman von Sanders, were already in Constantinople, tasked with the Herculean effort of reorganizing and re-equipping the shattered Ottoman army. To Enver Pasha, Germany was a model of everything he wanted the Ottoman Empire to be: militaristic, industrialized, authoritarian, and dynamic. He saw in the Kaiser a fellow man of destiny. While London and Paris offered condescending loans with political strings attached, Berlin offered rifles, artillery, and a military alliance of equals, or so it was framed. The negotiations were conducted in the deepest secrecy, far from the ears of Sultan Mehmed V. He was the Caliph, the spiritual head of a global Muslim population that Britain and France sought to control, but he was a bystander in the most critical foreign policy decision of his reign. The Pashas knew that an alliance with Germany meant an inevitable clash with the Triple Entente. It was a gamble of existential proportions, betting the entire future of the empire on a German victory in the coming European war. The whispers from Berlin promised a restoration of honor, the recovery of lost lands, and a new dawn for a revitalized empire. It was a siren song that Enver and his allies could not resist. In the simmering heat of August 1914, 2 ghosts slipped through the Mediterranean. They were the SMS Goeben, a state-of-the-art German battlecruiser, and its escort, the light cruiser SMS Breslau. With the great powers of Europe declaring war on one another, the ships were trapped, hunted by a superior British fleet with orders to sink them on sight. Their commander, Admiral Wilhelm Souchon, faced an impossible choice: fight a hopeless battle or make a desperate run for a neutral port. But Souchon had a secret directive from Berlin. He was to make for Constantinople. What followed was one of the most dramatic naval chases in history. Dodging British patrols, Souchon pushed his ships to their limits, his engineers working frantically in the searing heat of the boiler rooms. The fate of the Ottoman Empire hung on the speed of his engines. As the German cruisers approached the Dardanelles, the gateway to the Ottoman capital, Enver Pasha made a decision that would seal his nation's fate. Defying the cabinet members who pleaded for neutrality, he gave the order to let the German ships pass through the strait's formidable defenses. The British fleet, blocked by international law from pursuing them into neutral waters, could only watch in fury as their prey escaped. The arrival of the Goeben and Breslau in the Golden Horn sent shockwaves through Constantinople. To preserve a thin veil of neutrality, the Ottoman government announced it had purchased the ships from Germany. The German sailors were given fezzes to wear, and the Imperial German Navy flags were replaced with the Ottoman Star and Crescent. The Goeben was renamed the Yavuz Sultan Selim, and the Breslau became the Medili. But this was a fiction that fooled no one. A German admiral now commanded the Ottoman fleet, and German guns more powerful than any in the region now sat anchored before the Sultan's palace. Sultan Mehmed V was presented with a fait accompli. The German ships were a loaded pistol placed in his hand by Enver Pasha, aimed squarely at Russia. The decision for war had effectively been made for him. The fateful voyage was over, but the empire's journey into the abyss of the First World War had just begun. In the grand courtyard of the Fatih Mosque on November 14, 1914, an ancient and terrible power was invoked. An old man, Sultan Mehmed V, stood before the sacred relics of the Prophet, his voice frail but his title immense. He was the Caliph of all Sunni Muslims, and he was declaring jihad, a holy war against the Entente powers. The declaration, read aloud by the Shaykhul Islam, was a masterpiece of political theater, crafted not in the pious halls of the palace, but in the smoke-filled rooms of the Committee of Union and Progress. Enver Pasha and his comrades saw the caliphate not as a sacred trust, but as a geopolitical weapon. They dreamed that this call would ignite a firestorm across the globe, that millions of Muslims in British India, French North Africa, and the Russian Caucasus would rise up and throw off their colonial masters. The scene in Constantinople was electric. Banners unfurled, cannons boomed, and crowds roared their approval, swept up in a tide of patriotic and religious fervor. But Mehmed V, the supposed leader of this global insurrection, was its central, tragic puppet. He was reading a script, performing a role demanded of him by the Young Turk triumvirate. He lent his ancient spiritual authority to a thoroughly modern nationalist war. As the words of the fatwa echoed across the city, a deeper question lingered in the quiet corridors of power. Would the call be answered? Or was the caliph's voice, once capable of shaking empires, now just a hollow echo, drowned out by the roar of cannons and the new, competing loyalties of the 20th century? The declaration was a desperate gamble, using the Sultan's holiest function to serve a secular, high-stakes political game from which there would be no return. As the largest amphibious invasion in history unfolded on the Gallipoli Peninsula in 1915, the fate of the Ottoman Empire hung by a thread. In his gilded cage at Dolmabahce Palace, Mehmed V received fragmented, heavily managed reports. The news was dire. A massive Anglo-French fleet, the most powerful in the world, was attempting to force the Dardanelles, to seize his capital and knock the empire out of the war. For months, the fighting was a brutal, bloody stalemate. The hills of Gallipoli became a slaughterhouse, a testament to the tenacity of the Ottoman soldier defending his homeland. Then the impossible happened. The invaders were repulsed. The great fleet was turned back, and the land invasion, after unimaginable casualties on both sides, was abandoned. The news reached Constantinople like a thunderclap of divine deliverance. The city erupted in celebration. The victory was framed not merely as a military success, but as a miracle. It was a triumph of faith, a defense of the caliphate's heartland against the crusading infidel. The propaganda machine of the cup went into overdrive, casting Mehmed V as the victorious Ghazi Sultan, under whose blessed reign the empire had defied the odds. He presided over ceremonies, awarded medals, and led public prayers of thanks. His image was everywhere, a symbol of resilience. Yet the true architect of the defense, a determined officer named Mustafa Kemal, remained largely in the background for now. The victory belonged officially to the Sultan. It was a potent, desperately needed symbol of strength that solidified the CUP's grip on power and gave the empire a renewed, if ultimately false, sense of hope. For Mehmed, it was a moment of profound relief, a victory won in his name, even if not by his hand. While Ottoman soldiers fought foreign invaders at Gallipoli, a far darker campaign was being waged within the empire's own borders. The Committee of Union and Progress, citing fears of an Armenian fifth column sympathetic to Russia, decided on a final, horrific solution. On May 27, 1915, the Ottoman Parliament passed the Tachir Law, the temporary law of deportation. It was a deceptively simple piece of legislation, authorizing the military to deport any populations deemed a security threat. To become law, it required one final signature, that of Sultan Mehmed V. The document was placed before him, a routine administrative act in a time of war. It is almost certain he did not grasp its true, monstrous intent. The triumvirate of Enver, Talat, and Jamal Pasha controlled the flow of all information to the palace. They would have presented the law as a necessary wartime security measure, a temporary relocation to protect the integrity of the state. The Sultan, isolated and politically neutered, signed it. With that stroke of a pen, he unwittingly provided the legal cover for the systematic destruction of the Ottoman Armenian people. What followed was not a simple relocation. It was a centrally organized campaign of death marches, mass executions, and starvation on an industrial scale. The Caliph, the theoretical protector of all his subjects, became the legitimizing authority for the annihilation of one of his oldest Christian communities. His signature on the Tachir law is a stark and terrible symbol of his powerlessness. He was the sovereign in whose name the orders were given, the state-sanctioned violence carried out. Yet he was a ghost at the heart of his own government, a monarch whose authority was wielded by others to enact a crime that would forever stain the final years of his empire. By the spring of 1916, the Ottoman war effort was strained to its breaking point. The fronts in the Caucasus and the Sinai were collapsing, and the Arab revolt was simmering. The empire desperately needed a victory, a sign that God had not abandoned the Caliph. That sign came from the dusty plains of Mesopotamia, from a small besieged town on the banks of the Tigris called Kut al-Amara. For nearly 5 months, an Ottoman army under the command of Halil Pasha had encircled a British Indian force led by Major General Charles Townshend. After several failed relief attempts and with his men starving, Townshend had no choice. On April 29, 1916, he surrendered. Over 13,000 British and Indian soldiers were marched into captivity. It was the single largest surrender of British arms since the American Revolution. The news sent shockwaves of jubilation through Constantinople. Here was a victory not of desperate defense like Gallipoli, but of offensive triumph. The mighty British Empire had been humbled. For Sultan Mehmed V, it was a moment of immense, unambiguous pride. He awarded Halil Pasha the honorific title of Kut to commemorate his victory. Captured British standards were paraded through the streets of the capital in a grand spectacle designed to bolster public morale. The victory was hailed as proof of the Ottoman army's rejuvenation and the righteousness of their cause. It was a brilliant flash of the empire's old martial glory, a final, defiant roar. But it was a fleeting triumph. The strategic situation remained grim, and the resources squandered in Mesopotamia could not be replaced. For the aging Sultan, however, Kut was a ray of light in the growing darkness, the last great military victory his empire would ever know, a glorious but ultimately hollow echo of a power that was already fading into history. In 1914, when Sultan Mehmed V, in his capacity as Caliph of all Muslims, declared a holy war, a jihad, against the Entente powers, the Committee of Union and Progress believed they had unleashed an unstoppable force. They envisioned a tidal wave of Islamic solidarity, from North Africa to India, rising to cripple the British and French empires. But the call that echoed from the minarets of Constantinople fell on deaf ears in the most sacred of places, Arabia. In the heart of the Hejaz, Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the custodian of Islam's holy cities, was listening to a different voice. It was the whisper of British gold and the promise of a unified Arab kingdom. In June 1916, the unthinkable happened. Arab forces, guided by a charismatic British officer named T.E. Lawrence, raised the banner of revolt against their Ottoman overlords. This was not merely a military insurrection. It was a profound spiritual and psychological betrayal. The very people who were supposed to be the vanguard of the Caliph's holy war were now fighting alongside his Christian enemies. For Mehmed V, This was a devastating blow. His title of Caliph, the one source of authority the Young Turks could not entirely strip away, was rendered hollow. The revolt shattered the centuries-old narrative of Ottoman leadership over the Muslim world. The dream of pan-Islamism, a key pillar of the Cup's wartime ideology, dissolved into the desert sands. While Enver Pasha and his comrades raged against the treason, the aging sultan in his palace was forced to confront a bitter truth. The empire was not just being dismembered from without by foreign armies, but was rotting from within, torn apart by the very loyalties it had once commanded. While the world burned, Sultan Mehmed V resided in a state of suspended animation within the gilded cage of Dolmabahce Palace. From his windows he could see the shimmering waters of the Bosphorus, the lifeblood of his capital, yet he was utterly disconnected from the currents of power that truly directed the empire's fate. His days were a meticulously choreographed sequence of empty rituals. He would receive carefully vetted reports from the front, preside over state ceremonies that held no real significance, and affix his imperial seal to decrees written by others. He was the Sultan, the Padishah, the Caliph, and yet he was a prisoner of the very government that ruled in his name. The three Pashas, Enver, Talaat, and Cemal, were the true masters of the Ottoman state. They were the ones making the life-and-death decisions, forging alliances, and prosecuting a war that was consuming a generation of his subjects. Mehmed was a symbol, a crucial piece of constitutional theater required to lend legitimacy to their regime. He knew it. The palace staff knew it. The foreign ambassadors knew it. This powerlessness was a quiet, gnawing torment. He had spent decades in seclusion under his brother Abdülhamid II, dreaming of the day he would rule. Now he sat on the throne, surrounded by more opulence than any monarch could desire, but the authority he craved was a phantom. The news of defeats, of starvation in the cities, of entire armies vanishing in the snows of the Caucasus, reached him as distant, sanitized echoes. He was a spectator to the agony of his own empire, a ghost haunting the halls of his own palace. A monarch's reign is ultimately measured not in years, but in the fate of his people. For Mehmed V, that measure was an abyss of death. The Great War was a relentless engine of slaughter, and the Ottoman Empire was fed into its gears from all sides. On the Gallipoli Peninsula, the shores were forever stained with the blood of 250,000 Ottoman soldiers, young men who had died defending the capital from invasion. In the east, the Caucasus front became a frozen graveyard where Enver Pasha's ambition had led an entire army to perish in the winter cold. In the sands of Mesopotamia and Palestine, thousands more fell to British bullets and, worse, to disease and starvation. But beyond the battlefields, a deeper, more horrific tragedy was unfolding within the empire's own borders. Under the authority of the Kapi government, the Armenian population of Anatolia was systematically uprooted, deported, and massacred. On brutal death marches into the Syrian desert, countless men, women, and children perished from starvation, thirst, and violence. It was a cataclysm of unimaginable scale, a wound on the soul of the land. While the direct orders came from Talat Pasha and the CUP's inner circle, it all happened under the reign of Sultan Mehmed V. Did he know the full extent of the horror? Was he deliberately kept in the dark? Or did he choose to look away, overwhelmed by his own impotence? History offers no easy answers. What is certain is the weight of the dead. Over 1 million Armenians and hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians from every corner of the empire. Their ghosts would forever haunt the final years of the Ottoman state, a silent, damning testament to the carnage over which the powerless Sultan presided. By the winter of 1917, the Ottoman Empire was on the verge of total collapse. Its armies were battered, its treasury was empty, and its people were starving. The war had been a relentless series of disasters, a slow, grinding defeat on 3 fronts. Then, from the north, came news so extraordinary it seemed like a miracle. The Russian Empire, the ancient and formidable foe of the Ottomans for over 3 centuries, was imploding. The Tsar had been overthrown. The government was in chaos. Vladimir Lenin and his Bolsheviks, seizing power, wanted out of the imperialist war at any cost. For Enver Pasha and the CUP, this was a gift from heaven. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 saw Russia not only withdraw from the war, but also cede vast territories in the Caucasus. The nightmare on the Eastern Front, which had consumed hundreds of thousands of Ottoman lives, was suddenly over. An entire front had simply vanished. This was more than just a reprieve, it was a perceived opportunity. With Russian forces gone, Enver Pasha's pan-Turkic dreams were reignited. He envisioned a new Eastern Empire, uniting the Turkic peoples of the Caucasus and Central Asia. Ottoman forces, freed from fighting the Russians, began to advance, retaking lands lost for decades and pushing into new territories. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed as if victory might be snatched from the jaws of defeat. This glimmer of hope, however, was a false dawn. It masked the rot that had set in elsewhere. The Arab revolt was raging. The British were pushing relentlessly through Palestine, and the home front was disintegrating. This sudden success in the East was a fleeting illusion, a final, desperate gamble by a regime that had already lost the war. By the winter of 1917, the Ottoman Empire was not merely bleeding, it was exsanguinating. The initial patriotic fervor that had swept through Istanbul in 1914 had long since frozen over, replaced by a gnawing, desperate hunger. In the capital, the specter of famine haunted every street. In the provinces, disease and starvation harvested more lives than enemy bullets. The news from the fronts was a relentless dirge of defeat. Baghdad, the ancient capital of the Abbasid caliphs, had fallen. And then came the most spiritually devastating blow of all. Jerusalem, the third holiest city in Islam, was surrendered to the British under General Allenby. For Sultan Mehmed V, this was a wound from which he would never recover. He was the Caliph, the spiritual leader of all Sunni Muslims, the guardian of the holy cities. And under his reign, Al-Quds was lost. From his gilded chambers in the Yıldız Palace, the 73-year-old Sultan received the dispatches. His health, already fragile, began to collapse under the immense psychological weight. He was diabetic, weary, and trapped. For decades he had been a prisoner of his brother, Abdülhamid II. Now he was a prisoner of the Committee of Union and Progress, a figurehead for a war he had not chosen, presiding over the dismemberment of a 600-year-old legacy. He would attend ceremonies, his expression a mask of vacant sorrow. He would review troops, his frail form lost in the heavy military greatcoat. But the light in his eyes, the very light of the House of Osman, was fading. He was the shadow of a sultan, ruling over the shadow of an empire as the long, dark night of defeat descended upon them all. In the cold spring of 1918, a rare glimmer of victory penetrated the gloom of Istanbul. Russia, consumed by its own revolution, had collapsed and signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. For the Central Powers, it was a triumph. For the Ottoman Empire, it meant the recovery of territories lost decades earlier: Kars, Ardahan, and Batum. A ceremony was arranged in the palace. The document, a testament to a victory on a front that no longer mattered, was brought before the Sultan. Here was the pageantry of power in its most hollow form. Enver Pasha, the true master of the empire, stood by, his face radiating a confidence that bordered on delusion. Talat and Jamal, the other architects of the war, looked on. They needed the Caliph's authority, the spiritual ink of his signature, to legitimize their gains. Mehmed V, looking older and more tired than ever, was handed the golden pen. His hand, thin and trembling, moved slowly towards the paper. What thoughts passed through his mind in that moment? Did he see this as a genuine victory, a reprieve from the cascade of defeats in Palestine and Mesopotamia? Or did he understand the profound, tragic irony of the scene? He was signing for the return of Caucasian provinces while the Arab heartlands of his empire were being irrevocably torn away. He was endorsing a victory in the east while total collapse loomed in the south and west. His signature was not an act of will, but a final choreographed movement in a play written by others. The nib scratched across the parchment, the last meaningful state act of his life. It was the signature of a man confirming a reality he no longer controlled, the official seal on a beautiful, poisoned chalice. The summer of 1918 arrived in Istanbul with a suffocating heat, mirroring the fever that was consuming the empire. And in Yıldız Palace, the Sultan himself was succumbing to a final internal collapse. For 4 years, Mehmed V had been the stoic, silent symbol of Ottoman endurance. He had outlasted czars and seen empires buckle. But his body, ravaged by diabetes and the profound stress of his reign, could endure no more. In late June, he fell gravely ill. The best doctors in the capital were summoned, but they could do little. The machinery of his body was simply shutting down. As he lay in his chambers, the world outside churned towards its bloody conclusion. On the Macedonian front, the lines were about to shatter. In Palestine, Allenby was preparing the final offensive that would annihilate the Ottoman armies. The fate of the empire was being decided in trenches and staff headquarters hundreds of miles away, and the Sultan's death was but a footnote, an inconvenient pause in the management of the war. On the 3rd of July, as the sun began its descent over the Bosphorus, casting long melancholic shadows across the city, Mehmed V Reşad drew his last breath. He was 73 years old. There was no grand drama, no epic final words. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic end for the 35th sovereign of the House of Osman. In a final, poignant irony, he was spared the ultimate humiliation. He would not see the armistice, the occupation of his capital, or the final ignominious dissolution of the empire he was sworn to protect. The sun set on his life, just before it set on his world forever. How does history remember a man who reigned but never ruled? Sultan Mehmed. The fifth's legacy is one of profound absence. He sits on the throne for 9 tumultuous years, a longer reign than many of his 19th-century predecessors, yet he remains a spectral figure, a ghost in the grand narrative of his time. He is utterly overshadowed by the figures who surrounded him, his paranoid and autocratic brother, Abdülhamid II, who kept him locked away for 30 years, the formidable triumvirate of Enver, Talat, and Jamal Pasha, who wielded the real power of the state, and his successor, Mehmed VI, who would bear the cross of the empire's final surrender. Mehmed V was the Caliph who declared a global jihad in 1914, a call to arms meant to rally the Muslim world against the Entente. It was a spiritual weapon of immense potential, but it fizzled, failing to ignite the widespread rebellion his German allies had dreamed of. He was the constitutional monarch who restored the parliament, only to watch it become a rubber stamp for a military dictatorship. He was a kind, cultured man, fond of literature and poetry, who was forced by fate to preside over one of history's most brutal and total wars, including the horrific Armenian genocide that unfolded under his nominal authority. His story is the tragedy of the right man in the wrong epoch. A gentle soul placed at the helm of a war machine, a constitutionalist trapped by authoritarians, a symbol of tradition swallowed by the violent birth of the modern age. He was a footnote in the story of the Great War, a powerless patriarch watching his house burn down. His true legacy is that of a phantom, a final, sorrowful placeholder for an imperial power that had already died, even as its heart was, for a few last moments, still beating.